That is in fact Air Force One that has just touched down in New Delhi, and the security arrangement being carried out at New Delhi as well at the airport. The US security forces as well as the consulate staff, all of them waiting for Joe Biden, along with the Indian welcoming group as well, headed by Singh is what we understand. The United States Air Force jet just landing right now, and Joe Biden, the President of the United States, has come down at the New Delhi airport, and it is being said that the President would first meet with the welcome party, after which he would be moving for a bilateral at around 7:45. We would get details about it. This particular bilateral will be held at the PM's residence at 7 RCR, and this is the majestic Air Force One, the plane that carries the United States President, said to be a flying White House all in itself. And of course, you can see the security arrangement that has been carried out. The bilateral between India and the United States is stated to be one of the biggest side meetings that are happening at the G20. It is said to be an attempt to also ensure that the ties that have gained momentum in the recent past is carried forward again, and this time with defense deals as well as with regards to nuclear reactors. It could be a big file on the table of both the world leaders like Modi as well as Biden. We are expecting them to in fact negotiate these items as well. It is being said that when it comes to Prime Minister Modi, he has in fact fostered closer ties with the United States, and one of the significant facts of Joe Biden in fact coming in at the moment is that it comes at a time when the Congress has ensured that the jet deal between the nations, which is being proposed, especially when it comes to GE's F414 jet, which is said to be the powerhouse for the LCA. Well, no objection has been given by the US Congress on that, especially when it comes to technology transfer. TOT is an aspect of Indian defense deals, and 80% of TOT is what is expected in that. And also several other bilateral issues also might be coming up for discussion, especially with regards to more consulates in both the countries, deeper ties with the Indian academic fraternity as well, facilitating the flow of students to both the universities in India as well as the United States. Well, the security arrangement being carried out on the ground as the stairway to the plane is being pushed towards the main door for Joe Biden's arrival. In fact, everyone has been waiting for the arrival of the US President at the G20. He, however, did mention that since the Chinese President Xi not coming in was a disappointment at the same time. Well, it is also being said that with the United States, the question has also been about how the United States would view several of India's attempt at green development as well. President Joe Biden had gone ahead and said that he has been impressed with some of those aspects of the development that we see. Also, interestingly enough, India has been actually looking at ensuring that financial flow in the world markets is in fact restored. The US is in fact one of the key investors when it comes to the financial flow in world markets, especially when it comes to investing and to move away from the protectionist regime that has been put into place as well. US President Joe Biden had left for India from the historic G20 Summit, and he has in fact arrived. It is being said that the US Air Force One has just touched down, and we are expecting Biden to in fact step down. Well, there was a health scare when it came to Joe Biden. What we understand was that Jill Biden was tested positive for COVID, and there was a health scare whether the US president will be able to attend the G20 summit or not. However, the White House did say that the president did undergo two tests, and both the tests have turned out negative, and therefore it was decided that the president would in fact go ahead and attend the G20 meet. Biden will be accompanied by U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, Deputy Chief of Staff Jen O'Malley Dillon, and Director of Oval Office Operations Anito Simini, and is expected to meet PM Modi at his residence for the bilateral discussions on Friday. Well, the G20 Summit and its presidency holds big significance for India as such. India is looking at changes when it comes to world institutions as well as the bilateral attempts that India is trying to have on the sidelines of the G20 meet to negotiate with world leaders as well to bring a change when it comes to the G20 approach on several fronts, including climate change. A very significant aspect of the G20 discussions would revolve around climate change and green development. The red carpet there being rolled out by the people on the ground. It is going to be a red carpet welcome for President Joe Biden that we in fact see over here. Well, that is the red carpet being rolled on the ground for the U.S. President. He will be received by VK Singh is what we understand at the moment. We have the U.S. Special Services also on the ground who provide security for the President, who is also keeping an eye on the events that is being carried out. Well, we have the doors opened and probably in a few minutes we would have Joe Biden walking down on to that red carpet. So it's a red carpet welcome that has been given to Joe Biden. India, meanwhile, will be hosting around 200 meetings in 32 different sectors in multiple locations across India for this G20. This is the culmination of the series of meetings that we have seen with India's presidency of the G20. The G20 and its presidency has been taken with great interest by the Prime Minister Narendra Modi and said it is to showcase the country's strength when it comes to ensuring that its relations with several nations across the world on fronts like common global good is in fact seen. We do see that Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam was one of the aspects of the G20 meet, which is to say the world is one family, and how it affects everyone is the question that India has been raising, and also a look at the manner in which the things would be set forth when it comes to the discussions on the issue about trade and how the voice of the global south needs to be given an impetus. Meanwhile, this is the big bilateral that we are in fact tracking for you, the US-India bilateral that is going to be one of the most significant aspects of the G20 meet. Joe Biden is also expected to be invited for being the guest at the Republic Day. This is also one of the speculations that is coming in from the Foreign Office as well. But we're in fact just waiting. There we have Minister VK Singh out there waiting to receive the United States President. Well, the doors of the Air Force One has been open and we are just waiting for the US President to in fact alight from the aircraft. In fact, we did say that it is being said that Joe Biden has been looking forward to continuing the work with Prime Minister Modi, especially when it comes to the bilateral relationship as well. G20 member countries, meanwhile, ladies and gentlemen, represent around 85% of the global GDP, over 75% of the global trade, and about 2/3 of the world's population. So it is a very important meet, and the US President has just arrived at New Delhi for that big meet and summit. We have seen how much of importance India has been giving for the G20 meet, and the arrival of the US President, especially in New Delhi, would highlight the factor of the bilateral relationship that we are also seeing on the sidelines of the G20 meet. Now, one of the aspects of the G20 meets has also been that the Chinese President Xi Jinping has not given his consent to go ahead and attend the meet. Instead, it is the Chinese Premier Li Qiang who would be attending the G20 meet. It is being said that the US did say in its statement that it is up to China to decide whether it wants to be the spoil sport or not. However, India has in fact also ensured that the issue about how China looks at the border conflict with India, especially the tensions in the recent past, does not come in the way of the G20 meet as such. And of course, we have one of the important aspects of cooperations with the G20, we have the question about the GE jet engine issue, the MQ-9 Reapers on 5G, 6G, on collaboration in critical and emerging technologies, and progress also in the civil nuclear area. Remember, it was George Bush, the junior George Bush, who had in fact initiated the process about it. Well, in the studios, we have with us Shweta Kotari, who also has been following with keen interest when it comes to the G20 meet. When it comes to the United States, what are the key aspects of economics that we're going to see probably being on the discussion table? Of course, we've been talking about trade ties, defense ties. It took a lot for those defense ties to come in. But interestingly enough, I was reading a comment that the transfer of technology when it comes to General Electric is probably one of the first that the United States is planning to have when it comes to India, because when it comes to India's defense deals, TOT seems to be one of the biggest factors.
You know, it's interesting, Verghese. Thanks very much for having me on the show. It's interesting you brought in technology, because not just technology, of course, being the forefront of what the Prime Minister has been hoping to get on the bandwagon of as far as the US is concerned, but also primarily semiconductor, which is where India has been lagging for a very long time. And we know Micron is going to set up a plant in India very, very soon. There's massive investments that have already been proposed by the way of that mega event where we saw Indian Prime Minister going to the US. Some big promises were made, not just by various semiconductor companies, but also by tech giants. He had a meeting with the Tesla CEO, and those big promises, of course, are expected to come into fruition in some time now. But India is eyeing technology and a technology partner, specifically with respect to what's going to come by the way of semiconductor mission plan. India's ambition to become a semiconductor, or operate rather, a semiconductor fab perhaps in next 4 to 5 years. It's going to be a long drawn plan, but more the merrier. So more companies that come into India, more trade agreements that are signed, more investment promises that are made, is going to help India realize that dream of having a semiconductor fab perhaps in the next couple of years.
One interesting aspect has been about nuclear reactors, and I was just saying that, George Bush had initiated the so-called civil nuclear deal with India, but that has never come to fruition, because as a country we've been saying that if you have to become a manufacturing hub, you are going to be power hungry, and who is going to give that? Your coal is not going to last for long. Your hydro power projects are still there, but they have to also look at the domestic aspect. But for industrial applications, if nuclear power can be put up in a large way, of course it will feed the industry that is going to get into the manufacturing sector. So that has not been happening for a very long time.
Absolutely, and interesting you brought in power and coal, and because that's been one of the focused key sectors for India for a very long time. There's increased demand, and we know that one of the top agenda for G20 would be financing projects that are greener in nature, that are more sustainable in nature, in a sense coming up with more and more financing towards green energy, or energy that is sustainable, moving away from traditional sources of power, coal consumption.
I think we have the president, in fact,
US president there, live.
Yeah, we have Joe Biden, the US president, alighting from his Air Force One. He's being received by VK Singh. Union Minister VK Singh will be in fact receiving him there. He having a word with the Air Force officer, and now VK Singh receiving him. Well, also some kind of background music given for that welcome as such. Of course, every dignitary I was seeing, from Kishida to the CC from Egypt, all of them were given some kind of a dance kind of a welcome as such. And then we have this, of course, that is the US ambassador to India, Gassetti, who is there to welcome the president also.
And perhaps his daughter?
His daughter also having a word
welcoming
with Joe Biden.
Absolutely.
Gassetti is so famous in India that he has used social media so effectively strongly to relay US policies, and
Right.
he goes with food but tends to end up saying that, we're going to have better relations with your country, and how much of an impact our economic relationship is going to have.
I have to talk about that because US is perhaps looking for an alternative to China, and India presents that opportunity. And by the way of the fact that both Joe Biden and Prime Minister Modi have great relationships. You've seen pictures coming out of when Modi was in the US and now Joe Biden is here in India. All of that, it's not just a picture perfect moment, it also augurs well for trade relations between the two countries. As of 2021, trade relationship, the bilateral trade ties between the two countries stand at about $157 billion. And those trade ties are only expected to deepen as the world is looking for a China plus one destination, and that plus one is inevitably India. It could be Thailand, it could be Philippines, but India, the market that India presents, the opportunity that India presents, not just in terms of resources that it has, but also the geography, all of that augurs well for a lot of manufacturing companies, for a lot of businesses that are looking for an alternative to China, and India is that alternative. Verghese?
I do agree. I think in there you have the beast, the vehicle that is carrying the US president. Of course, he will be going to 7RCR, but that is another piece of technology, as we were speaking about. It's said to be something that can stand an RPG attack. Of course, it's bulletproof, and also probably even a nuclear or biological attack. So it is one mission that is out there that displays US's level of tech perfection, and that's the aspect of it that also intrigues me also to a large extent. How much of technology you can cram into a car, and of course the US president's nicknamed vehicle, the Beast, crams a lot of that tech into it. So it's a miniature White House in a lot of ways. So of course, that on display, the US president has in fact just boarded his car, and of course we are expecting him to leave. So you were talking about how India is turning out to be that alternative for China. In a post-COVID world, I think the world just suddenly realized that there is just too much of over-dependence on China.
Absolutely, over-dependence on China, and perhaps that over-dependence has not yielded a lot of positive results for a lot of companies, including companies that are in tech business, that are in semiconductor business, because we've seen a China which is getting increasingly competitive. Just this morning, China banned iPhone for its government officials, which resulted in Apple's share falling as much as 7% and affecting both Dow Jones and S&P. So essentially, the idea being that if you look for one destination, which is what the world has done for a very long time, because China was very conducive as a place to invest. It had better policies, it had cheaper labor, they were rolling out a red carpet, and for a very long time, that was the market to go to set up an automobile company, to set up a semiconductor fab.
When I was speaking to one of the foreign trade analysts, he said one thing about China. He said that the West unknowingly just armed China. That's what they did. He was giving me since you brought the question of iPhone, he said the idea of a phone with a touch screen, well, that just got technologically transferred to China and just started making cheaper copies of it, and you cannot in fact compete with it at all. It's not one or two or three brands.
The scale of it,
you just cost of it. And what resulted is that what could have been one of your biggest product that could have been sold across the world, suddenly a huge market was eaten away by them. And he was also saying that including you guys in India just love Chinese phones because you were able to use it and it gave you exactly the same feeling. It might not be that great of an experience about its quality and duration, but it gave you that experience. And everyone goes for a product experience. That's what they were saying. And they just sold you that experience, and we just lost out on that huge market. And we became costlier, of course, and the Chinese benefited. So they were talking about how difficult is now any company in the US is having a difficulty in sharing know-how on production when it comes to China.
Absolutely, and not just production, come to think of it, there is and I said that I think somewhere in a bulletin, yes.
In fact, we have them in fact leaving from the Air Force One. Of course, he'll be having a bilateral with Prime Minister Modi. We are expecting that to be around at 7:45 is what we understand. Joe Biden being briefed by his staff. Welcome by Vicky Singh for the G20. And also, as I said, there's speculation that probably he would be our Republic Day guest as such. And since we were also talking about China, the Chinese president is not making. Of course, we have the political tensions that we had with them, but the Chinese president is not going to make it at all. The Chinese premier is going to be there. So again, it looks like one of the statements that Joe Biden. It's a disappointment when he came to know that Xi Jinping is not going to attend. But I think everybody knows who the elephant in the room was at that time.
Absolutely, and come to think of it, with Xi Jinping not attending, I think it's a big bummer. It's a big bummer by the way of what is going to come out finally, and perhaps there is going to be a joint declaration that will be signed at. It's not going to be a repeat of the Bali. It looks like it's going to be a repeat of the Bali, where there'll be a lot of agreements, disagreements. There may not be a joint communique on which each member country will agree upon, and the baton will be passed on to Brazil from here on. So essentially there was of course an expectation that he may not come till very last minute. We knew Putin is not going to make it, and days after that we heard Xi Jinping is not going to make it, and obviously there is geopolitical tensions between India and China, but all of that taking into account, there were also important messaging that was coming from China, which I think, and it came out yesterday, where you had China saying, okay, we trust in India's G20 presidency. We couldn't make it for whatever reason. They did not give out a reason. Let's be fair to that. They did not give out a reason, so they didn't say outrightly so, and they don't have to. I think it's implied in what's been happening between India and China at the border, and perhaps again going back to that, tensions not just in terms of geopolitical at the border, but also India proposing itself to be an alternative to China. That could also weigh in perhaps on Chinese premier's mind. We don't know any of that. There will be representation from China, but it's not going to cut it, Varghese, because you need the Prime Minister or the President or the head of state in order to sign a joint communique that can be endorsed by the G20 group.
But also, another factor that the person was pointing out was that he was saying that when it comes to China, there is a global race to secure mines that have rare earth minerals. They said that they've already depleted theirs, and now they've gone to Africa hunting for rare earth minerals. And it is a huge race that
and
some
China
people
has put in duties on that. So that's interesting, because some of these rare earth minerals are also used to make semiconductors. And so what happened is, as a result of US banning sharing technology with China on semiconductors, there was a retaliatory move from China, putting in a license in place for companies that are hoping to push out or export rare earth minerals, essentially also implementing some sort of license regulation to also protect its rare earth minerals. India has also found some of its own rare earth minerals. We have not done the exploration justice yet. We are now told private companies will also be allowed to do that, but it's a long road to travel. But I think it's just, come to think of it, very interesting developments playing out on a global field.
Well, this is where economics and politics and geopolitics is all playing at the same time. We have our tensions with them, and of course we are also trying to pitch ourselves, as you rightly pointed, when it comes to semiconductors. Suddenly they have realized that we are also so dependent upon it. But you were saying, like, it's not about China alone. India probably is in the lead when it comes to a series of countries, especially the Southeast Asian tigers as well, when it comes to semiconductors. They're just trying to ensure that you don't put all your eggs in one basket. So when it comes to the baskets, I think India is trying to get the maximum number of eggs, while it would go to some other countries as well. Vietnam is in fact becoming a very interesting destination as well.
Absolutely. Vietnam, Philippines, Thailand, all of them extremely interesting as alternatives. But also let's remember what India has and what many of these South Asian countries don't. We have the scale, Varghese. We have resources like no one else does. We have cheap labor, which we shouldn't be taking pride on at this point, but we still do. And all of that combined, the might of this country, the geographical vastness of this country is what makes it more lucrative. So
when you're saying cheap labor, you're talking about people, interestingly, once upon Microsoft's Bill Gates was saying that India will get all the high-tech jobs because they have they have the cost that will be very interesting for us to in fact invest in them. And you're talking about engineers who would be working in India. Of course, look at the salary scale that you're going to get. It's going to be quite good and up in India, but not the same when you look at United States. But that's going to make them quite lucrative. So we have a huge engineering talent pool that we can
do. Absolutely.
So that is what we are probably looking
engineering talent pool. We have we have workmen. We have, when I say cheap labor, I'm not just talking about labor that perhaps is not educated. I'm also talking about, when compared to global averages on salaries, Indian salaries also do not stack up really well. So the money that you would have to pay to an engineer living in the US as opposed to the money you'll have to pay to an engineer living in India, there's going to be a vast delta of difference between the two, which is what I mean when I say cheap labor. Having to set shop in a developed economy versus a developing economy, there are always reasons to choose, a latter or the former, and the reason being that you've got to pay lesser to do everything, including get that resource, the manpower, to do its work for
And also there's this trust factor, like unlike China, where the technology that you share, in India of course there are laws that would help them protect it, to keep it within themselves, unless you have a joint venture partner with you. It doesn't tend to be leaked out. This is another aspect of the law part of it, that some of them found it very lucrative, because in China of course they are known for reverse engineering really well, and I was giving you the example of the phone, but it's not the phone. They used to in fact reverse engineer entire warplanes. There's an interesting anecdote about how the Russians got fooled by the Chinese. It's about how the Russians, the Chinese made an order for more than 100 Sukhoi 35 planes, and then suddenly after 20 they just stopped. And the Russians were wondering why, and then later they realized that the same plane was re-engineered and remastered and reverse engineered and was put out as a version of Sukhoi, and they called it they gave it this thing, and
another
it was the same thing,
another spin, but the same tech.
Yeah, the same tech. And the Russians realized that they just gave them 20 planes and they just lost on in 80. So this is the actual thing that was happening. So when it comes to India, it's totally different. India partners, and India does not tend to reverse engineer as such. It gives that patent value as well. So that is something that has become very interesting, probably even one of those factors.
Patent value, come to think of it, it's the other way around. We have not protected intellectual property as much as US has, or Germany has, or France has, which is why a lot of engineers, when they want to patent something, they go abroad, which is where I think we lag majorly. While we also talk about all the good things that are happening in India and all the successes, it's also important to point out where we can do better, and perhaps patent technology is where we can do better. Patent technologies as much as you can, patent innovations, protect IPs, protect it, so that people are not just encouraged to innovate in this country, but they're also encouraged to stay in this country. So to stop that brain drain from happening, you've got to protect people. You've not just got to pay them, but also got to protect what they made for themselves and for the country.
One of the agendas, of course, when it comes to G20 is on green development. And the US tends to do a lot of lip service on that front, and especially because it's trying to say that some of its traditional industries could take that beating. How do you see this coming up again on the negotiation, again only lip service when it comes to green development?
Green financing, unfortunately, come to think of it, there's been a lot of lip service on green financing, on what kind of projects to finance, how much to finance, whether there's going to be a chart out for what money would be transferred towards greener projects. But India has made some good strides, and perhaps we'd like to apprise our viewers at this point in time, a lot of promises that we're making for our future generations, including burning of fossil fuel, and at the scale at which we continue to burn fossil fuels, maybe through generating power or maybe riding that automobile. India has ambitious plans. India wants to convert half of its fleet to electric fleet by 2030, and to do all of that, of course, money would be needed, and government is putting the money where the mouth is. So you've got PLI schemes, production linked incentive schemes that you're giving out to auto companies. There's similar PLI for other hardware companies, etc., etc. So as far as manufacturing is concerned, we're doing our bit. Companies are doing their bit by what they have promised in their ESGs. So yes, there is a plan in place. However, I think a climate activist, if they were to join us right now, they'd say countries have not done enough.
Since we were talking about PLI and manufacturing, how much of the manufacturing bus did we actually miss? A lot, is it? It's a very difficult question to answer, especially because I'm not somebody who's in the trade business. I mean, as a journalist, I can tell you that there are a lot of things that we've done good. So we've done well when it comes to manufacturing of autos,
auto parts. We've done well with hardware now. There was an import. Again, interesting, since we're talking about imports and we're talking about manufacturing, India is trying to protect itself right now. And one of the ways to protect yourself, to come up with more protectionist policies, is to have import curbs or restrictions or regulations in place. So very recently, on 3rd of August, India put in place a trade ban. A trade ban in a sense where a lot of companies, IT hardware companies who manufacture laptops, PCs, servers, palm tops, were told to stop importing them, to start making in India. Remember, Make in India has been a clarion call by the Prime Minister ever since 2014, and he's done his bid, and the government has done its bid. So, to continue that and to continue ensuring that more electronic manufacturing is happening within India, trade restriction was put in place. Some of the industry watchers and experts alluded to it as license Raj coming back to haunt India and India Inc. And by the way of this trade restriction, from 1st of November, an IT hardware company cannot import hardware from outside of India. So you've got to make in India. You've got to manufacture in India. And that hasn't made a lot of players like Dell very happy. In fact, it is expected that Biden, if he were to have a bilateral conversation with the Prime Minister, will take that up with Prime Minister Modi.
In fact, we have the UAE's Crown Prince also arriving at New Delhi for the G20 meet. He's also received by the concerned minister, who was in fact deputed for his reception. That was in fact the Crown Prince of UAE also, who just arrived and is being guided by the Indian staff as well as the members from the UAE consulate. Well, that is in fact some of those visuals coming in as well. So you were talking about how import curbs. Protectionism is another fact that G20 I think countries should discuss about it, because once upon a time, I remember from the 90s, everybody shouted about global village and the US was talking about global village. Exactly. And now it seems that nobody is talking about globalization.
Absolutely.
Nobody is talking about the flow of money. So how much it is important to restore the financial flow in global networks right now, because it looks like everybody is holding on to their purse strings.
Do you know, they are holding on to their purse strings, and rightly so. We've come out of very uncertain times, so you've got to be careful where you put your money. And investors have become extremely jittery of putting their money in volatile places, in volatile countries, in volatile assets. So they want to be very safe, they want to play very secure, perhaps put that money in bonds, put that money in FDs, put it in bank locker, don't invest it.
Go back to your traditional...
Go back to traditional saving methods. But in India, this is surprising. We discuss stock markets every day on the show. In India, you have domestic investors investing in domestic equities like never before. And Sensex and Nifty, and this was the straight 6th day trading session when Sensex and Nifty ended in green. They are today at an all-time high. What does it tell you? That there is some sort of level faith that a lot of people have, especially domestic institutional investors have in domestic equity markets. They are putting the money in our equity markets. Why? Because let's face it, India has remained resilient, and not just India says so, or Indian government says so, IMF says so, World Bank says so, various rating agencies are saying so. The world is looking at India as a safe haven, as a place which is insulated, which is not facing the same level of turbulence and volatility as perhaps many developed economies like Germany, UK, US is facing. Our inflation, albeit higher, is still within the range. It's in control. We'll have to wait for September numbers. But all in all, if I were to sum it up, the world is looking at India as a saver destination. And this platform will also be a platform to showcase to the world, for India specifically, that we have arrived. We have arrived not just by the way of leadership stability, but also through our economic prowess. So a brilliant platform at that. You know, you are talking about the 20 biggest economies of the world, and let's not forget, G20 is an economic grouping. It's not a political grouping. People forget that very
often. It's not a political. It's a economic grouping, in fact, and it is actually economic ties that, in fact, go when it comes to G20. But sticking with G20 as such, you know, another interesting aspect that I was, in fact, looking at when you were saying that, you know, they think India as resilient. Lot of countries. Whether it's Japan, you know, some of the big economies, Japan, Germany, you have China also. Demographic decline is becoming a worrying factor for most of these countries. And demographic decline means less number of people to actually buy products, and less number of people to buy products means your market is shrinking. India is on the other side of that particular.
I mean, you juxtapose that with a growing middle class, growing, you know, consumption in India, and you look at figures and charts that are astonishing to many. So you talk about, you know, India's demographic dividend. Our demographic dividend stands out. When we talk about a working population, it stands out as compared to a lot of G20 countries. So essentially, India is a lucrative destination at that too, where you have more younger people who are not just working more to build perhaps some economic value or add economic value, but also consuming more, demanding more. All of that helps us. You know, not an aging population, not a very young population in its infancy, but perhaps an age-appropriate population that can work, contribute to the economy, and also demand, consume, spend money.
So you would say this is the right time to be in India?
Absolutely. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if my future generation is going to say the same or say it better in any other better words, but yes, absolutely.
Well, that was in fact the UAE Crown Prince. Who had of UAE, who had just arrived and was given a welcome by our foreign service as well, and also by the consular staff of the UAE. There, the visuals there where he was received and was guided towards his car as well. Just a brief talk. All of them, in fact, are looking at India and the big G20 meet. UAE is actually a country that has got very close ties with our country. And
it started in 2022 through CEPA, which is the comprehensive trade agreement between the two countries, essentially a free trade agreement of sorts. And since then, the trade relationships between the two countries have only got better. In fact, very recently, and this is important to remember, since India is a net exporter, importer of crude oil and importer of oil in general, India is also looking at an alternative. Since Russian oil doesn't seem to be as lucrative in value and in money anymore, India is looking at UAE as an alternative to that. So of course there's a lot to be discussed with UAE when it comes to the comprehensive bilateral trade agreement between the two countries, the scope of which can be expanded to include perhaps more items, you know, look at more alternatives with what can be a CEPA in its full capacity. So CEPA that was signed in 2022.
I mean, when you talk about oil, India has really interesting supplies. You had Iran for quite some time, then you had the Russians. Of course, we tend to be very pragmatic when it comes to our supply with oil. You know, the Saudi prince recently also said that India seems to be a really bright spot when it comes to the Middle Eastern investment. Someone said that someone tried to, in fact, discourage him, and he said that, don't worry, India's economy will bounce back, and he has been, you know, prophetic when it comes to that. So the Mohammed bin Salman also has been looking at India as an investment hub, and this being said that he's influenced by the way UAE has been having close ties with India. So that is a very interesting aspect that came out from that as well. So you have, you know, the top leadership looking at India, where we are, and we've been showcasing those aspects as well. But let's look at the challenges. Of course, we've seen how the positives are there, but what are the challenges that limit us? Because domestic policies at the same time, you know, veers between liberalism and protectionism. There, in certain sectors we are liberal, in certain sectors we tend to be protective.
Absolutely, Varghese. I mean that is how one is expected to operate in these times. You've got to protect your own people first, and since you're talking about protectionism, a story that recently, perhaps I think you must have also taken it up on your bulletin, and we took it up here on our bulletin, which was with respect to ban of export of rice. And India was accused of exporting food inflation, and India was accused of giving it to the rest of the world by knowing that you're the second largest exporter of rice in the world, but you're not exporting anymore. You've put duties on non-basmati white rice, and there were allegations made, but let's give it to the government for trying to protect its own people. The challenge here, of course, is inflation, and inflation is a challenge not just for India, it's the challenge for a lot of developed economies, including the US at this point in time, and India is doing its best to ensure that at least vegetable pulses, food inflation remains in control. One way of doing that is to have enough buffer stock, and India is doing that. I think every country has done that. In the last so many years that we've been tracking all economic developments, and we've moved increasingly away from globalization towards protectionism. We've seen countries, their leaders making move to protect their own people. So our people come first. I think that
is the message that is going on. So if that was the case, when you see these multilateral forums, especially these economic multilateral forums like G20, does it still have that relevance? Because at the end of the day, you're not looking at the globalized world, you're looking at a highly protective nations about their economies. They don't want to open up the way they used to open up. In that scenario, what is exactly being discussed? Because if you look at the agendas as well, you're talking about green development, you're talking about things that are so futuristic, but what can be actually done on the ground?
Okay, so let's talk about a couple of things that are on the agenda. To begin with, a regulation for cryptocurrencies. And that is something a lot of countries have not arrived at individually. India has banned it outrightly. Just this morning, we had an IMF FSB paper suggesting that you shouldn't be banning cryptos because that's not going to cut it. Cryptocurrency will still be used through dark channels, and its online presence cannot be curbed. So essentially, don't outrightly accept it, but don't ban it, regulate it. So I think that is a paper that is going to give us some preview as to what is expected out of the G20 meeting. There has to be some regulation around crypto, their usage, and through the dark web, through maybe transactions, outright transactions. Will that happen? Not happen? We don't know. But
because
cryptocurrency
one of the
framework
biggest
is important.
concerns that have been, as you rightly pointed out, on cryptocurrencies, especially when it comes to the security establishment, is the manner of payment for buying whatever requisite material is for terrorists, and when they are one of those, then crime, organized crime.
So
again,
terror financing.
So terror financing, organized crime syndicates, all of them tend to be using cryptocurrency. So the regulation part has always been there, but then I'm just trying to understand. We are also trying to become more of an e-economy, in the sense that our payments are going to be on the e-mode, but cryptocurrency is a no-no.
Yes,
but
because it cannot be traced.
So that is one aspect.
You can't trace it, so you don't know who sent it, for what purpose. And again, one of the mandates of G20 group would be to look at terror financing, to find ways to nip it in the bud. And how do you do that if you ban a technology that allows for terror financing? You've got to identify the channels. You've got to identify them, regulate them, have enough policy measures in place so as to not neglect its presence, but to acknowledge that yes, there's an elephant in the room, yes, we know it's a challenge, let's find a way to work around it, right? So neglecting it, perhaps pushing our heads in the sand is not going to make the problem go away.
But when you're saying that when it comes to India, India has a stand, but there are countries where cryptocurrencies are traded, are given that kind of freedom.
And even in India, they're traded. That's the problem, Verghese. It's not like it's not traded in India. It's not just traded through official channels. You can't trade it through official channels, but you can still trade it on the dark web. That is the problem. You can stop something from being operational in a legal parlance, in a world where you would want things to happen as per the law of the land, but you can't stop things from happening, for example, on the dark web. You can't stop a payment from going through on the dark web. So then, therefore, you cannot just outrightly ban it. Banning something is not a solution. If it's a technology and it's in place and you can't trace it, acknowledge it and do something to curb it, because cross-border financing still happens a lot, and there are papers on papers that will tell you, I'm not saying it, I'm a journalist, my job is to report, there are papers on papers that will tell you that it is still being transacted, used in transactions that are not legal in nature.
Okay. Also, let me in fact get in this aspect of de-dollarization. And in G20, we are talking about countries that say, let's have this de-dollarization. Let's move the entire financial network away from the US. US shouldn't be looking as the only way of, settling debts and, payments between countries.
Absolutely.
So they've been looking at trading in local currencies and things. India has also been advocating that to an extent. But this is not in the interest of the United States. And of course, the United States will one day is going to react on this particular aspect.
But you can't do that, can you? I mean, come to think of it, for example, between Russia and India, the exchange is happening through yen, not happening through dollar, because obviously, sanctions that are in place for Russia is trying to avoid that. So it's not like the world will not find an alternative to the US dollar. It's just that how much and how far can we push it? I think that's going to be a challenge, and India's already been pushing for it. It's already, settling some of its trade with Bangladesh, for example, has settled in rupee. So
with Iran, we've settled with rupee.
Iran, we've settled in rupee. So essentially, the start of de-dollarization has already happened. How far can we push it? I think time will tell. But it's about time that if there is trade between two countries, and specifically bilateral trade, they have all the right to settle it in between the two of them in their local currencies.
Well, that's an interesting aspect, because one of the issues that a lot of nations have raised about is that once you go for de-dollarization, you tend to be somehow masked away from US sanctions. That is what they believe in, and that's what they actually try to propagate as well. But how much essentially can you have for de-dollarization in this world system? Because everything is on dollars. You ask any price, it's on dollars. Your oil is in dollars.
Absolutely.
Everything is, that is where the dollar gets its power. You're pegged against the oil. So how much of it is possible?
If you're asking me, is it possible to overthrow dollar as the traded currency for the entire world? I think it's a very far distant dream. But as I said, if you can do it with certain countries for a certain amount or a certain period of time, for example, for Russia, solely because Russia is trying to evade sanctions, but with other countries as well, where you have bilateral trade ties, you can do it. And there should be nothing stopping you at that. US cannot come to India and say, hey, stop doing it.
That is, a very interesting aspect that has come up, especially on de-dollarization. The other aspect is that India has been saying that it's trying to become the voice of the global South. Global South, when we talk about the economies that we think about, India or Southeast Asia or South Africa, Nigeria to an extent, Brazil in Latin America, which is probably the only stable economy now if we compare to the Latin American nations. This is technically said to be the global South. But what has the global South got to offer other than agrarian trade? If you minus the Southeast Asian...
A manufacturing destination, a place that will perhaps be your feeding bowl, which is where you get most of your eatable. So that's a part of the agrarian economy, of course, but again, extremely essential. You're getting your food from us.
Because the same question I asked an economist, and he said, Verghese, please understand one thing, that for any economy to function, like Napoleon said, every army marches on its stomach. So for any economy to function, you have to have food first.
Yes. So you cut us off, or you do not, perhaps give us a rightful place on the global map, you've got to lose. You can't ignore us anymore. We're not just another South Asian country. We're a country that will help you put food in your belly and perhaps allow you to hold the gadgets that you're holding, communicate through whatever technology you're using, give you your CEOs, give you your human resource. So yes, we are a country that has a lot to offer.
Interestingly enough, one more aspect of this agrarian trade when we're talking about, it's about wheat. And we've seen how wheat trade has been affected across the world, especially because of Russia and Ukraine, some of the best lands where, we have wheat growing, and that has not come into the world network as such. India is feeling a pinch of it because it has domestic demands. The US has to also meet up with its domestic demands. And recently, when Turkey tried to have a grain deal with Ukraine, they just bombed Danube port. So how far are we going to see when it comes to wheat trade? Does G20 even, in fact, think about discussing about wheat trade? Because wheat is very essential when it comes to all of them. And it looks like they are still not ready to accept the fact that it is going to become a problem soon.
Well, I think I'm not very certain if on a very specific weight or a rise or pulses, all of that is going to be on the agenda, since it's a bigger global economic grouping. I'm sure they are not going to look at some very small items on the agenda, but if it were to be, it could be a very interesting discussion.
Let us in fact see how that aspect of it we are going to reflect on. And one other aspect that has also been there is when it comes to G20 is that a lot of people say that the G7 are the Brahmins and the G20 are the Kshatriyas. Is there any aspect on that? Could you please come again, please, Verghese? I want to hear that again because I've never heard it again before. Some people say that G7 is the Brahmins and the G20 are the Kshatriyas.
Okay.
So
I'm hoping there can be a non-casteist sort of comparison. I'm really hoping that we can be non-casteist about this. Perhaps this could be the G20 Shudras. I'm not sure, but I would like that very much. I mean,
it was how the Indian mindset was looking at it, because they say that they tend to have their own group within the group, and they tend to in fact keep their interests looked at, and then suddenly they say, oh, we need to just include them when it comes to some executive work, and then they talk about G20.
Well, again, as I said, I hope there was a little bit of a non-casteist comparison there, but I do believe that G20 is as powerful as it gets. You're talking about 20 biggest economies of the world. You're talking about not just emerging economies.
So that's why I want to, is G7 still relevant?
Well, I'm nobody to write it off. I'm not a pundit, political pundit, or an economist. I would rather not write it off.
You would not write it off, but still, I was unable to recall how the Greeks in fact had it, because they had a certain aspect of it put in place. That is to say that within their society they had the people who had the wealth who decided upon. So I'm just not able to recall what they were called. So I would have given a different nomenclature for that as well. However, that aspect is there. 20 economies of the world, biggest economies of the world. I was just reading out that statistics as well, like what the G20 actually constituted of, and it has one of the biggest influential groups as such. But again, the political tensions within G20 is something that is also quite there. Of course, in this, the biggest person or the elephant in the room is China, and political tensions created by China as well. It's on our borders, it's with the US and other countries as well, especially when it comes to Southeast Asia. We had a recent talk about how ASEAN views China as well. So, political tensions, how much can it deride G20?
Well, ideally, this is not a political forum, but then you cannot sidestep politics in anything, especially as a country as we are, as diverse, as divergent. Politics is going to underpin everything we say, everything that comes out of G20, every statement that is made, every agreement that is signed. It's all going to be Verghese political in nature, right? Politics is at the heart of any economic bounding or unbinding, or a decoupling, as you'd like to call it. So politics is what drove China away from the US and US towards India, and politics is what's going to bind these countries, or keep them apart, separate them. And let's not forget, it is politics why Xi Jinping is not coming. It is politics why Putin is not going to make it. So politics decides the fate of every grouping, G7, G20, ASEAN, BRICS, everything.
So, since you brought out that factor, BRICS, well, in that we have the Russians and the Chinese on one side, and we are in a different, because we have the Quad grouping as well. But in that case, G20, is it a forum to in fact continue with? Is it just intellectual discussions going on, or can anything concrete come out of it?
No, I believe something extremely concrete by the way of the agenda. And since we were discussing the agenda, apart from cryptocurrency, a lot of these countries are expected to also look at debt restructuring. Remember, we are, and many other countries around us in Asia, including Sri Lanka, Pakistan, are in extreme poverty and debt. And they're looking at some of that debt to be restructured in a fashion where they don't have to pay the humongous interest, and they do not owe their political affairs to the country that has given them that debt. And guess the country? It's China. So all the money that comes in from China, it's not in China's best interest to restructure that debt. But debt restructuring is unfortunately, a very prominent aspect on the agenda that G20 countries will have to look at. We are looking at some of the most poorest countries in the world who have been given cheap money only to be taken that money at a time when needed, or political favors that is needed. So China is very interestingly using debt as an instrument, as a tool. And my colleague Rakesh Kharu was sitting here with me in the same studio just about a couple of hours ago. He in fact reiterated how strategic the move is for China to be using debt as a tool, as an instrument for making these countries subservient to Chinese interest. And we need to look at how to restructure this debt for some of these countries to prosper, for poverty-stricken countries to be elevated or alleviated in years and decades to come. So perhaps that's also going to be at the top of the agenda.
Since you talked about debt, has IMF vacated its place to China, cheap loans from China?
Well, I'm also a little worried about you have an IMF, you have a World Bank, and you have these Western institutions who are perhaps the lending institutions of the West, which very quickly sanction or not sanction money as per their whims. And I am using that word very carefully. And that is again something that South Asian countries, BRICS nations will have to delve deeper on. You cannot just have Western institutions lending out money and big countries lending out money at cheap rates, which is where you need to have a multilateral bank, which is again going to be on the agenda.
Well, we have Justin Trudeau, who has just arrived. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has just arrived as such. Just at, of course, there we have Rajiv Chandrasekhar, who will be receiving him, Justin Trudeau's arrival for the G20 meet. We're just, in fact, waiting for those visuals.
Lovely visuals that are playing up. I think, I don't know if there's some sound to it, though.
There seems to be an act that can be, in fact, played on that.
सर सर सरसों सर को
कर 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 चूड़ियां करके
कर चूड़ियां करके
अचरा सर सर सरसों सर को कर कर चूड़ियां करके तड़ 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 मटके चटके झर 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 मैं भीज गई भरी भरी
Tina, Tina, da, gotta get it, सर सरसों सर को
कर 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 चूड़ियां करके
कर चूड़ियां करके
अचरा सर सर सरसों सर को कर 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 चूड़ियां करके तड़ तड़
BrahMos. Stealthy, lethal, precise. It flies at 3 times the speed of sound and cuts through a warship like a hot knife through butter. China's navy has threatened its neighbors, and they are turning to the BrahMos for protection.